A pink backpack left in the woods. A child's desperate note. And a secret buried beneath a quiet town. What happened next will shake you, and restore your faith in what's right. If you're ready for a story of bravery, betrayal, and a dog who never gave up, like this video, subscribe, and don't look away. The truth deserves to be seen. The town of Maple Hollow was the kind of place that didn't make the news. Tucked into the southern stretch of Oregon, where the pines grew thick and the roads twisted gently through golden hills, life moved at the pace of falling leaves. That morning, autumn had dressed the forest in its brightest fire, reds, ambers, and fading golds carpeting the narrow trails just outside the town limits. A light mist hovered low, curling around branches like breath held in prayer, and the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Henry Foster walked that trail every morning. At 65, he moved with a limp born from an old injury, but his shoulders still carried the dignity of his past, straight, steady, military. His silver hair was always neatly combed beneath his old ranger cap, and though his brown canvas jacket had seen better years, it was always zipped and dust-free. People in town knew him as Sheriff Henry, even though he'd retired nearly a decade ago. Since then, he'd lived alone in a quiet cottage on the edge of town, sharing it only with his German shepherd, Ranger. Ranger, now 6 years old, was a large, striking dog, muscular and disciplined, with a thick coat of black and tan fur. A faint scar traced his right shoulder, a reminder of his years as a trained K-9 in Henry's service. But since retirement, Ranger had mellowed. He was still sharp-eyed and alert, but now took comfort in quiet routines and slow walks. Henry talked to him more than he did most people, and Ranger listened with the kind of attention only dogs or ghosts could offer. That morning, they followed the usual path, past the split oak, over the shallow wooden bridge, then left at the mossy stump. The forest was mostly silent, save for the caw of distant crows and the occasional creak of trees settling into the cold. But halfway through the trail, Ranger stopped. It wasn't unusual for him to pause. He often chased scents, birds, or nothing at all, but this time, his ears flattened and his nose twitched with a different urgency. Henry followed his gaze and saw it. Sitting in the center of the leaf-covered trail, like it had been placed with purpose, was a small pink backpack. It was a child's pack, frayed at the corners, one of the zippers slightly busted. It sat upright, perfectly centered, too deliberately placed to be accidental. Henry frowned, taking a cautious step closer. Ranger growled low in his throat, then barked, a sharp, urgent sound that bounced off the trees like a warning. Henry held up a hand. "Easy, boy," he said, kneeling beside the backpack. He didn't touch it at first. Years of instinct still hummed beneath his skin, even after all this time. The pack was damp, flecked with fallen leaves, and one strap had a faint brown smear across it. He reached out carefully, unzipping the main pocket. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, crumpled at the edges, but dry. The handwriting was childish, jagged, slanted left. "My name is Ellie. My mom is locked in the basement. Please don't tell my dad." Beneath the note was a small plastic bracelet made of pink beads, and a drawing, a stick figure woman lying down, another figure standing beside her with something in his hand, colored red. The child had tried to scratch over the man's face. Henry stared at the note, then back at the empty trail. He turned to Ranger, who was still standing stiff, nose pointed toward the deeper woods. "You smell something." The dog barked again, this time pacing toward the underbrush before stopping, glancing back as if urging Henry to follow. But Henry hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. He looked down at the backpack once more and felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just a call for help. It was a message from someone who had no one left to trust. Henry picked up the pack and stood there, trying to steady his breath. It had been years since he had last felt this particular weight, the heavy, haunting sense that someone out there needed him. The last time had been his own son, taken in a car accident that no one saw coming. His wife, Margaret, never recovered. She passed 2 winters later, her heart quietly giving out. Since then, Henry had buried himself in silence and routine, letting time smooth his memories like stones in a river. He hadn't saved anyone in a long time. But this wasn't about redemption. This was about a pink backpack left on a trail, intentionally, bravely, by a child who believed someone might still care. Ranger let out a low whine and nudged Henry's leg, as if to say, "What now?" Henry turned back toward the trailhead. "We go home," he said, voice hoarse. "And we figure out what the hell is going on." He didn't know who Ellie was. He didn't know where she lived or how long her mother had been trapped. But he knew this: children don't write lies like that in the rain. As he and Ranger walked back toward town, the mist thickened, curling around their feet like fog over a battlefield. Henry felt the old ache in his leg, but he ignored it. His eyes stayed sharp, focused, awake in a way they hadn't been in years. Something was terribly wrong in Maple Hollow. And he had just been handed the first thread. Henry's boots were soaked by the time he and Ranger reached the front porch of the cabin. Rain had begun to fall, just a whisper at first, but now steady, needling through the trees and pattering against the tin roof like an impatient drum. He shrugged off his canvas jacket, droplets scattering, and hung it on the old wrought iron hook beside the door. The house creaked as he stepped inside, the warmth from the fireplace doing little to thaw the chill creeping into his spine. Ranger shook himself off and trotted straight to the living room, his paws leaving small prints on the worn floorboards. Henry placed the pink backpack gently on the kitchen table beneath the hanging light. The bulb flickered for a moment before settling, casting a soft glow over the faded fabric. He sat down slowly, his leg aching from the cold, and unzipped the pack with a breath held tight in his chest. This time, he examined the contents with practiced care. There was the note again, folded carefully. He reread it, hoping for something new, a clue between the lines. Then came the drawing. The paper was slightly smudged from the earlier rain, but the image still pulsed with dread. The stick figure woman lay flat, arms outstretched, hair scribbled in brown pencil. Standing beside her was a tall, looming figure with harsh red lines drawn around the object in his hand, maybe a bat, maybe a pipe, maybe something else. The face had been heavily scratched out. Henry set the picture down and reached deeper. His fingers brushed something cold, metal. He pulled it out. It was a key, old, rusted, still slightly damp. Its handle was shaped like an oval, the teeth dulled with time. It didn't belong to any modern house he'd seen in years. Last was the fabric. A piece of faded flannel, torn, darkened with what he could only assume was dried blood. No fresh scent remained, but the weight of it was unmistakable, like pain soaked into cotton. Ranger growled softly, watching him, head low and ears twitching. "You remember what that smell means, don't you?" Henry muttered, placing the fabric back into the backpack and zipping it closed. Ranger responded with a low huff, his tail flicking once. Henry sat back, rubbing his eyes. The fire crackled in the hearth behind him, but his mind was far from comfort. It had been nearly 5 years since a case had brought that same sick knot to his stomach. Lila Green. She'd been 29. A substitute teacher. Soft-spoken, polite, lived on the edge of town. One day she vanished, left behind her car, her cat, an unopened letter from her sister. No body, no note, no real evidence. They searched the woods for weeks. Nothing. Eventually, the town moved on, as it always did. But Henry never forgot the location of the last known sighting, not far from the path where he found the backpack. He stood slowly, his knee clicking, and crossed to the bookshelf in the hallway. He pulled a thin leather folder from the bottom shelf, old case notes. Dust floated in the air as he opened it. Grainy photos, a map, a timeline. He tapped his finger on a red circle drawn years ago, the tree line near Old Ash Hollow. That was just past where Ranger had started pulling earlier that day. Henry looked down at the dog. Want to see if your nose still works? Ranger lifted his head and stood. No bark. No tail wag. Just readiness. They set out again, rain still falling but the storm moving east. Henry took the pickup this time, heading around the back roads to reach the far side of the woods, near a stretch the locals called the Ridge. Most of the properties out there had been abandoned or sold to weekend hunters. A few remained occupied, barely. As he drove, the trees closed in, their limbs skeletal against the gray sky. Every so often, Ranger would lift his nose to the crack in the window and sniff. When Henry reached the ridge, he slowed. A sagging mailbox, its letters faded to almost nothing, leaned by a rusted gate. The fence was broken in places, patched with old planks. Beyond it stood a house. Not old enough to be condemned, not new enough to feel safe. It was a one-story structure with chipped green paint and a warped porch. The curtains were drawn. No car in sight. Ranger let out a short, stiff bark. "Yeah, I see it too," Henry said, parking a little further down and cutting the engine. They approached quietly, with Ranger moving ahead, his body low to the ground. Henry kept his hand near his coat pocket, not for a weapon, but for the badge he still carried though long expired. The smell hit him first. Damp wood, rotting leaves, and something sharper, chemical. Like mildew mixed with disinfectant. Ranger growled as they reached the porch. Henry knocked once on the door. Silence. Again. Still nothing. Ranger padded toward the side of the house, ears forward. Henry followed. Around the back, they found a shed, doors chained, but the lock was newer than the building itself. Just beyond it, partially hidden by brush, was a second entrance, possibly to a cellar or storage space, its door made of warped plywood with a rusted latch. Ranger began to paw at the ground, whining softly. Henry crouched and inspected the door. Faint scratches along the edge, small, shallow, as if made by fingernails. His breath caught. He stood up, wiped the rain off his face, and stared at the house. Someone lived here. Or had. And someone else, maybe Ellie, had come here too. But it was too soon to break in. He needed more. Back at the truck, he took out a small notebook and wrote down everything, the key, the location, the scratches. He'd need to call someone. Not the town sheriff, they'd write him off. No, he'd call Kate. Kate Monroe was the only nurse still working nights at the local health clinic. 38, sharp-tongued, with a reputation for cutting through red tape and sentiment alike. Her dark hair was always tied up, and her navy blue scrub seemed to hang off her wiry frame like she never quite stopped moving. Most people found her intimidating. Henry trusted her. Years ago, she'd been a victim too, hospitalized after defending herself against an abusive partner. Since then, she'd made it her mission to notice things others ignored. He dialed her number. She picked up on the third ring. Foster. I assume this isn't about your cholesterol? I found something, he said quietly. Or someone. The morning fog still lingered like smoke as Henry parked his truck at the bottom of the gravel drive. The house stood there again, gray, tired, hunched like an old man clutching secrets under his coat. It wasn't a place that welcomed questions. The sagging porch slats, the mildew-streaked siding, the curtainless windows, everything about it whispered, "Don't knock." But Henry wasn't there to ask permission. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the front door, ears flicking at every distant sound. Henry gave his side a soft pat. Let's see what kind of man lives here. They crossed the yard slowly, boots crunching on the damp ground. As they reached the porch, Henry spotted a fresh boot print in the mud, larger than his own, deep and recently made. He rapped on the wooden door, firm but not aggressive. After a few moments, it creaked open. Standing behind it was a man in his early 40s. Tall, lean, built like someone who once spent years in gyms but had long since traded discipline for apathy. His hair was short but unkempt, dark blonde with graying streaks near the temples. A faint scar traced along his left jaw, half hidden by stubble. His eyes, icy, flat, tired, didn't blink when they met Henry's. He wore a wrinkled t-shirt, faded jeans, and no shoes. One of his hands still held a mug, steam curling from the top. "Yes," the man said, his tone dry, clipped. No greeting, no curiosity. Henry cleared his throat. "Morning. Name's Henry Foster. Just walking my dog through the ridge and thought I'd ask." He motioned toward Ranger, who stood stiff at his side, eyes locked on something behind the man. "Have you seen a little girl around here recently? Brown hair, maybe 8, pink hoodie." The man's jaw twitched. "No. Her name's Ellie." "No kids here," he said again, more sharply. "Just me." Ranger growled then. Not just a low hum, but a guttural warning that made the man's shoulders shift subtly. Henry didn't look at the dog. "You mind if I ask your name?" The man hesitated for half a second, then answered, "Travis." Henry nodded like he expected that. "Well, Travis, sometimes kids wander off around here. If you see anything strange, maybe let someone know." His eyes shifted just slightly to the left, toward the narrow hallway behind Travis. At the end was a door. Old. Wooden. And locked with a shiny new bolt. Travis caught the glance and moved subtly, placing his body in front of the view. "You said you were walking your dog, not investigating." Henry smiled politely, but his eyes stayed cold. "Old habits die hard." "I'm sure they do," Travis said. "But you're not sheriff anymore." Henry raised his eyebrows slightly. "How'd you know I used to be?" "Small town," Travis muttered. "Word gets around." There was a pause, quiet enough to hear the creak of the trees outside. Then Travis stepped back, beginning to close the door. "I've got nothing for you." Ranger lunged suddenly, barking violently at the floorboards just beneath the door Travis had stood in front of. His hackles were up, eyes wild. "Control your dog," Travis snapped, but Henry's eyes didn't leave the hallway. "Smell something," Henry said quietly. "And he's not the type to bark at shadows." With a click, the door shut in their face. Henry stood still on the porch, jaw tight. He didn't knock again. He waited for the silence to settle, then crouched beside Ranger and whispered, "Good boy." Ranger's tail thumped once but his eyes never left the house. As they walked back to the truck, Henry's mind raced, not with theories, but memories. That door. That locked door hadn't been there during his last visit. Someone had reinforced it, as if they were keeping something in, not out. Before he even turned the ignition, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Kate picked up after 2 rings. "If you're calling before 8 a.m., someone better be bleeding." "Might be," Henry said. "You still at the clinic?" "Just got off night shift." "Why?" "Need your memory," he said. "Couple weeks ago, you mentioned seeing a little girl. Came in with a man, but you said something felt off." Kate paused. "Brown hair. About yay tall?" she asked, voice sharpening. "Wearing pink?" "Yeah," she confirmed. "She had a scrape on her palm. Said she fell on a gravel path, but didn't look me in the eye the entire time." "The guy with her, tall, quiet, blondish? Kept cutting her off when I asked questions." "That's the one," Henry said. "Name's Travis. Just spoke to him. He says he lives alone." Kate cursed softly under her breath. She kept touching a necklace around her neck like it was a shield. "When I asked to speak with her alone, the guy insisted she was just shy and didn't do well with strangers." Henry felt his stomach turn. "You think she's in danger?" Kate asked. "I think she already was." There was silence. Then Kate added, "You want me to file a welfare check?" "Not yet," Henry said. That'll alert the sheriff. And if he's got any friends in uniform. Kate didn't argue. She knew the town's politics too well. So what now? Henry looked at Ranger. I wait. And watch. But if I'm right, that girl didn't leave that house. Before they hung up, Kate said one last thing. I'll dig into clinic logs. See if her name ever came up officially. And Henry? Be careful. Men like him, if he's hiding something, he's already ready to fight to protect it. Henry ended the call and stared back at the house through the windshield. Behind the shutters, behind the locked door, he could almost feel it, a pulse, faint and trembling. Something, or someone, was in there, too quiet for the world to notice. But not quiet enough for a dog like Ranger. The next morning unfolded in a veil of golden mist. The sky over Maple Hollow was pale and drowsy, the forest still dripping from the night's rain. The trail behind Henry's house was quiet, too quiet. Birds chirped in short, unsure notes, and the wind barely touched the treetops. The hush felt loaded, like something was waiting. Henry had barely finished his coffee when Ranger began pacing near the door, ears perked, nose twitching. At first, Henry dismissed it as restlessness, but then the dog gave a low, urgent whine, the kind he hadn't heard since their working days together. Ranger stood by the door, looking back at him with pleading insistence. All right, Henry muttered, setting down his mug. Let's see what you found now. They followed the trail that curled east of the property, one Henry rarely walked anymore. It sloped downward through a grove of sugar maples, then bent beside a narrow stream that ran fast during the spring thaw but now babbled quietly over smooth stone. The path was overgrown in places, moss creeping between roots, and patches of early frost still clung to shaded logs. And then Henry saw her. The little girl sat alone on the edge of the stream, knees drawn to her chest. She wore a dark brown hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing her hands. Her jeans were damp at the hems, and her white sneakers were stained gray from the mud. Her hair, dark brown and tangled, hung in a curtain that half covered her face. One of her shoelaces was untied. She didn't flinch when Ranger trotted closer. In fact, she reached out slowly, as though she had already dreamed this moment and was only now confirming it was real. Ranger nuzzled her hand gently, then laid down beside her with a soft groan, as if to say, I found you. Henry approached with care. Ellie? He asked, keeping his voice low. She looked up, and for the first time, he saw her eyes, wide, brown, rimmed red, and ringed with the kind of shadow no 8-year-old should carry. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she unzipped her hoodie pocket and pulled something out, a small silver heart-shaped pendant, tarnished and cracked at the hinge. She held it tight. This was my mom's, she said softly. It broke when he pushed her. Henry knelt beside Ranger, not too close to scare her. Where is she now, Ellie? Ellie glanced behind her, toward the slope beyond the trees. She's still in the basement. Under the shed. He locks it from the outside. I tried to help. I tried really hard. But I'm not strong enough to pull her up the stairs. Henry's stomach turned cold. Is she alive? The girl nodded. She talks to me through the vent. I sneak food when I can. But it's getting harder. Her voice was small but steady, like someone who'd spent every drop of fear and only had resolve left. Henry looked at her closely, thin frame, torn cuff on her sleeve, dried blood on her left knuckle. She'd been surviving. Not just hiding. I found your backpack, he said. The note. The drawing. I believe you. Ellie bit her lip. I didn't know who else to trust. You have Ranger. Dogs know. I saw him once. He looked at me and didn't turn away. Ranger, hearing his name, let out a low chuff and nudged Ellie's side again. She reached down and scratched behind his ear with practiced familiarity. He's not like the others, she whispered. He wouldn't leave. Henry cleared his throat, trying to contain the ache building behind his ribs. You were brave to do what you did. Most grown-ups wouldn't have. Ellie didn't smile. Her face remained still. I wasn't brave. I was scared. But if I didn't tell someone, she'd disappear. Henry looked at the necklace again. May I? Ellie hesitated, then handed it over. It was engraved on the back with tiny initials, SB. A hinge held it barely together, one side showing a small photo of a woman smiling, blonde, bright eyes, likely taken years before. The other side was empty, the photo missing. That's Sarah, Ellie said. My mom. Henry froze. The name was familiar. Sarah Bennett. 5 years ago, she'd been a nurse in a nearby town before quitting her job and moving away. He remembered her name in a list of routine background checks during a local dispute, but nothing more. Now, her daughter was sitting in front of him, clutching what was left of her. You said she's under the shed, he asked. Ellie nodded. Behind the chicken coop. There's a door in the ground. He keeps it locked with a bolt. Henry looked up at the slope. And you live in that house? With Travis? The girl's hands tightened into fists. He's not my dad. He tells people he is, but he's not. My real dad left when I was 2. Mom thought Travis would protect us. At first, he was nice. But then he started locking the phone in his car. And yelling. Then she wasn't allowed outside anymore. And school? Ellie shook her head. He said I could learn at home. But all I did was clean. And be quiet. Henry inhaled slowly. He didn't want to press her too hard, but time wasn't on their side. Ellie, why now? Why not before? Because she told me to run, Ellie whispered. She told me if something happened again, I needed to run and find someone who'd believe me. She said, soldiers are trained to listen. Henry blinked, caught off guard. She told you to find a soldier. Ellie nodded. I remembered Ranger. And the badge on your cap. It was such a small thread to cling to. And yet, she'd followed it. I'll get her out, he said quietly. Ellie looked up at him again. Promise? Henry held her gaze. I promise. They sat in silence for a while. The stream murmured. Ranger dozed lightly, head in Ellie's lap. Henry stared at the slope ahead, already mapping his next steps, what tools he had, who he could trust, how soon he could move. But more than anything, he knew one thing now with absolute certainty. Someone needed to answer that locked door. The wind was harsher that afternoon, bending the treetops in low, murmuring waves. Leaves scattered across the ridge like the forest was trying to erase footsteps, conceal truths. Henry's truck rolled to a stop beneath the cover of bare-limbed oaks. The house loomed ahead, sullen and quiet. The front porch sagged slightly more than before, or maybe it only looked that way now that he knew what lay behind its walls. Kate Monroe stepped out from the passenger side, buttoning her heavy wool coat. She had changed out of her scrubs into old jeans and hiking boots, a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. Her dark hair was tied into a tight bun, and she wore no makeup, as always, just the kind of expression that made people sit straighter when she entered a room. Sharp, decisive, the kind of woman who had seen enough suffering to stop tiptoeing around it. This is the place, she asked. Henry nodded. He's not home. I drove by the gas station a few minutes ago. Saw him heading east in an old white pickup. Kate checked her watch. Won't be gone forever. We won't need long. In the back seat, Ranger shifted. The German shepherd's eyes were locked on the house, his body tense but quiet. His instincts buzzed through every muscle. He hadn't forgotten the scent he'd picked up before, not just fear, but blood, and something darker. They moved quickly. Henry led the way around the side of the house where a narrow path, half covered in dead leaves and broken branches, led behind the crooked shed. The ground sloped down just slightly, revealing a small wooden platform tucked beneath an overhang. It was a storm cellar door, secured with a rusted bolt. A dented padlock hung from it. Henry reached into his coat and pulled out the old key, the one from Ellie's backpack. The metal slid in, stuck for a second, then gave with a hollow click. The lock dropped. Kate gripped the edge of the door. "Ready?" Henry gave a short nod, then helped her lift. The cellar door groaned open like it had been holding its breath for years. A rush of cold air spilled out, stale, thick with mold and something more metallic. Ranger sniffed, then let out a low, deep whine and began descending without hesitation. The stairs creaked with every step as they followed. The narrow passage led into a cramped space with a concrete floor and bare wooden walls. The only light came from the narrow beam of Henry's flashlight. Dust swirled in the beam like ghosts. The smell was stronger here, musty, earthy, with an undercurrent of rot. In the corner, curled up beneath an old blanket, was a woman. Sarah Bennett. She was tall but painfully thin, her body wrapped in a torn coat. Her hair, once blonde, was matted and dull, falling across her face in tangled knots. Her eyes were swollen, one almost shut completely. A purple bruise climbed along her cheekbone. Her wrists were red where the skin had been rubbed raw, likely from struggling against restraints. But her chest rose and fell. Shallow. Slow. Alive. Kate dropped to her knees beside her, already pulling gloves from her bag. "It's her," she murmured. "She's still breathing." Ranger stepped closer, lowered himself beside Sarah and pressed his warm body against hers. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply laid there, as if giving her permission to trust again. "Pulse is weak," Kate said, pressing 2 fingers to Sarah's neck. "She's dehydrated. Malnourished. But no spinal injuries from what I can tell. We need to warm her and elevate her legs." Henry pulled his coat off and laid it gently over Sarah's lower body. "Ellie said she's been bringing food." Kate glanced at him. "Then that little girl kept her mother alive. And no one even knew." As Kate continued her checks, Henry stood and swept his flashlight across the rest of the basement. Shelves lined one wall, tools, old paint cans, boxes. One corner was covered with a moldy tarp. He moved toward it, lifting the edge. Behind the tarp was a small wooden cabinet bolted into the concrete. Not locked, but hidden. Henry opened it. Inside were several cassette tapes in old plastic cases, a notebook wrapped in rubber bands, and a small envelope marked only with initials, SB. "Kate," he called quietly. She looked up, face pale under the flashlight beam. He handed her the tapes. "Check the labels." Kate turned them over, reading aloud. February 12th. April 3rd. August 17th. Her voice hardened. "They're dated like journals. Each one has a number next to it." She opened the notebook. Inside were short, hastily written entries. Some no longer than a sentence. He yelled again. "Locked the phone in the shed. Ellie cried when I bled on the floor. I told her it was tomato sauce. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make Ellie disappear first." Kate closed the notebook, hands trembling. "This isn't just abuse. It's control." He documented it like trophies. Henry reached for the envelope. Inside were photographs, printed from a cheap inkjet printer. One showed a bruised forearm. Another, a close-up of a burn. But the last one. He froze. It was Ellie, asleep in what looked like the back of a truck, a thin blanket draped over her. Taken from above. He watched them even when they didn't know, Henry whispered. Kate carefully placed the items back into her bag. "We bring these to the sheriff, he'll bury it." I know, Henry said. Which is why we don't go to the sheriff. Sarah stirred then, a soft whimper slipping from her lips. Kate leaned close, brushing matted hair from her face. Sarah, it's okay. You're safe. Ellie sent us. The woman's one good eye fluttered open. She didn't speak, just stared at Ranger beside her, then at the strange woman kneeling at her side, and finally at Henry, who stood back, hands clenched at his sides. She's in shock, Kate said gently. But she knows. Somewhere in there, she knows. Ranger nuzzled Sarah's shoulder. She exhaled a shallow breath and reached a trembling hand toward his fur, letting her fingers curl into his warmth. We need to move fast, Henry said. Before he comes back. Kate nodded. You drive. I'll stay with her in the back. As they lifted Sarah carefully and made their way back up the stairs, the wind outside began to howl. Leaves spiraled through the air like warnings too late to matter. But down in the dark, behind them, the basement door swung gently, half open now, the truth no longer sealed. The ride to the clinic was quiet but heavy with urgency. Henry kept his eyes on the road, every twist of the gravel path pulling him further into a storm he hadn't meant to enter but could no longer walk away from. In the back seat, Kate held Sarah upright, whispering to her in slow, steady tones while checking her vitals. Ranger lay across the truck bed behind them, his gaze constantly shifting between Sarah and the window, alert for anything unfamiliar. Sarah's body was frail, but her grip on Kate's arm had tightened since leaving the basement. She wasn't fully conscious, but somewhere inside her, a flicker of awareness had been reignited. The pendant Ellie had given Henry now rested around Sarah's neck again, clasped carefully by Kate after cleaning the blood-stained metal. They reached the town's medical outpost, barely more than a two-room facility used mostly for treating minor injuries and flu seasons. But Kate had access and trust. She waved them in through the back door, bypassing the reception entirely. Inside, Henry helped ease Sarah onto an examination table. Her head lolled, eyes fluttering open only briefly before exhaustion dragged her back under. Kate moved like muscle memory, checking oxygen, adjusting saline, applying ointment to the bruises and scrapes. Ranger sat at the door, blocking it as if he knew they weren't safe just yet. Henry stepped outside for a moment, cell phone in hand. He scrolled to the contact for the County Special Case Division, a number he hadn't dialed since his days on the force. He uploaded the files from the envelope and the hidden basement tapes onto a secured folder and forwarded the link, attaching a short message. Urgent, abuse victim recovered alive. Evidence of long-term captivity and threats. Possible link to 2017 and 2019 missing persons cases. Name, Travis Cole. See tapes labeled 2A, 3F. Then he pressed send. Back inside, Ellie sat silently in the corner of the room. She had followed them without a word, but her eyes never left her mother. Henry walked over and knelt beside her. She's going to be okay, he said softly. Ellie's voice was a whisper. He's going to come back. He always does. Henry reached over and took her hand gently. Not this time. And that's when they heard it. The sound of tires on gravel. Henry's face snapped toward the window. Ranger stood instantly, muscles tight, a growl vibrating from deep in his throat. Kate glanced up from the monitor. That's him, isn't it? Henry nodded once. Stay with her. He stepped into the hallway as the front door burst open. Travis. He looked different now. Not just angry, but feral. His hair was damp from the drizzle, face flushed and jaw clenched. His clothes were disheveled, and in his hand was a crowbar. His gaze scanned the hallway before locking onto Henry. You son of a, he started, charging forward. Ranger was there first. The dog launched forward with a bark that shattered the hallway silence. He positioned himself between Travis and the exam room, teeth bared, his body tense as a drawn wire. Travis skidded to a stop, eyes wide, the crowbar lowering by instinct. Henry stood just behind Ranger, calm but unmovable. "You're not taking one more step. You broke into my house." Travis shouted. "You stole my family." "They were never yours," Henry cut him off. "You locked that woman underground. You threatened a child. You recorded every sick thing you did." Travis hesitated. Just a flicker, but it was there. And that's when Ellie stepped into the hallway. She didn't speak. Didn't cry. She simply walked past Ranger and stood between Travis and her mother's room. Her small frame was trembling, but her chin was raised. Travis stared at her. "Go back inside, Ellie. Now." She didn't move. Behind them, the sound of sirens sliced through the quiet like a blade. 3 patrol vehicles skidded into the parking lot, gravel flying. Henry glanced toward the window. Kate had triggered the emergency panic line before they left the house. She had done it silently. Efficiently. Just like she always did. 2 deputies rushed in first. The taller of the two, Deputy Marquez, a young Latina woman with a strong presence and a scar that ran along her left cheek, stepped between Henry and Travis. "Drop the weapon," she ordered. Travis snarled, raising the crowbar again. Ranger bared his teeth, ready to pounce. But before things turned bloody, a third voice entered the hallway. "Travis Cole, step down." The command came from Lieutenant Andrew Corrigan, head of the county task force. A tall, dark-skinned man in his 50s, Corrigan was calm, deliberate, and respected even by those who didn't like him. His voice didn't raise. He didn't threaten. He simply expected obedience. Travis hesitated again, the fight draining as fast as it had risen. "This is illegal," he growled. "They broke in." "We have the tapes," Corrigan interrupted. "We have the notes. The photos. And the testimony of your stepdaughter." Travis blinked. "She's not my." But he didn't finish. Because 2 deputies stepped forward and disarmed him. Handcuffs clicked into place. Travis didn't fight. Not anymore. As he was led out the door, he looked back once at Ellie. His expression twisted into something unreadable, half fury, half fear. She didn't flinch. Ranger stood beside her, and she reached down to rest her hand on his back. Corrigan turned to Henry. "We'll review the files you sent. There may be other victims, possibly going back years." Henry gave a tight nod. "Start with Lila Green. 2017. Corrigan's eyes flicked up, surprised. "That name's not been on my radar in a while." "It should be," Henry said. "She lived 2 roads over from where Travis used to work as a handyman." Corrigan nodded. "We'll dig." As the patrol cars pulled away, the hallway slowly emptied. The clinic returned to quiet, only the beeping of Sarah's monitor and the hum of the old air vent. Henry stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Ellie followed a moment later, still holding Ranger's leash. She looked up at him. "Is he gone?" she asked. Henry looked at the space where the squad cars had vanished. For good. A week had passed since the sirens faded from the clinic's gravel lot, and Maple Hollow was starting to breathe again. The skies over the town, once muted with tension, had shifted. Mornings were still cold, and the leaves still danced along the pavement like embers in the wind, but something had softened. Even the silence of the woods seemed gentler. Sarah Bennett had been moved to a safe recovery wing in a shelter 40 miles out, a discreet, secure facility for women and children escaping domestic abuse. The staff was discreet, gentle. The walls were painted in soft tones, and the windows were always cracked open to let in light. She had gained a few pounds since arriving, her skin no longer sallow, her eyes more focused. The bruises had faded into yellow-gray patches. Her voice, once almost a whisper, had started to return. Sarah was a woman in her mid-30s, tall but delicate in frame. Years of emotional strain had hollowed her features, but even through the trauma, there was a quiet resilience in her. A former nurse, she had once been fiercely independent and well-loved in her community. That light had dimmed after years of isolation, yet in recent days, something behind her eyes had begun to reawaken. The way she brushed Ellie's hair behind her ear, or the way her fingers paused over a flower pot on the windowsill, small gestures spoke of a woman remembering what it was like to live, not just survive. Ellie was never far from her side. At the shelter, she stayed close during meals, curled up beside her mother in the shared twin bed at night, and only recently had begun venturing into the center's activity room. Her hoodie had been replaced with a warm sweater and soft jeans. A new pair of pink sneakers, donated by another family, squeaked slightly on the linoleum floor as she walked. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it looked like dawn breaking over frost. Kate visited often. She wasn't officially assigned to the shelter, but she had a way of slipping through red tape like wind through trees. She brought books for Ellie, snacks for Sarah, and news for Henry, who, since the day of the arrest, had remained just outside the edges of the system, quietly helping push it along. On a quiet Saturday morning, Kate held her first community first aid class in the small multipurpose room of the town library. The banner on the wall read, "You don't have to be big to save someone." Ellie was her first student. The other kids, 5 in total, ranged from ages 6 to 10. Most were children of single parents, a few from local farms. All sat cross-legged in a semicircle as Kate demonstrated how to check breathing, apply gauze, and wrap a bandage. But Ellie was different. She didn't just watch. She memorized. Kate knelt beside her with a cloth wrap and asked, "What's the first thing you do when someone's hurt and you're scared?" Ellie looked up. "Breathe first. Then help." "Exactly," Kate said, smiling. Sitting near the front, panting softly and wagging his tail, was Ranger. He wore a red bandana around his neck with the words, "Canine Assistant," printed in white. The children took turns petting him. Ranger didn't move much during the lesson, he simply sat, alert and calm, as if he knew his job was no longer to fight, but to comfort. After the class, Ellie stepped outside with Kate and found Henry waiting by the truck. He wore his usual canvas jacket and a knit cap pulled low over his ears. In his hand was a small box, neatly wrapped. "Thought she might be ready," Henry said quietly. Kate nodded. "I think so." Ellie stepped forward and Henry knelt, offering the box. She opened it slowly and found a collar, smaller than Ranger's, made of soft brown leather. Hanging from it was a silver tag engraved with the words, "Ranger, Hero." Her eyes widened. "For him?" Henry nodded. "He's never had a real one. But I figured you should be the one to put it on." She crouched, hugging Ranger tightly before slipping the collar around his neck. "Now everyone will know," she said. "That he's the one who found me." Henry cleared his throat, looking away. That afternoon, they took a walk, not through town, but back into the woods, back along the path where it all began. Henry led the way, the trail still familiar beneath his boots. Ellie held her mother's hand the entire time, and Ranger walked beside them, ears flicking with every forest sound. They reached the place near the stream, the spot where the pink backpack had been left like a message in a bottle. Ellie stopped and looked around. The trees seemed taller than she remembered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old key, the one that had opened the basement lock. It no longer felt like something to keep. She knelt beside the stream and placed it on a flat stone, weighing it down with a pine cone. Sarah stood behind her, watching quietly. Henry approached with a new thermos of tea and offered it to Sarah. She took it with both hands and gave a soft, "Thank you." They stood together for a while, letting the quiet speak. "You know," Henry said, "this place, it used to feel cold to me. Since Margaret passed. Since my boy." His voice caught. "But now, it feels like a place where something good can grow." Sarah glanced at him, and for the first time, she smiled. Ellie reached for her mother's hand, her other resting on Ranger's back. "Can we come here sometimes?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Any time." Ranger barked once, short and content. They didn't talk much on the walk back. There was no need. The wind was soft, the sky open, and the long shadow of fear had finally receded into something that could be named, and therefore let go. Late autumn settled gently over Maple Hollow like a soft woolen blanket. The golden leaves had faded into burnt oranges and browns, the sun hung low even at midday, and a faint chill wrapped the wind. In the town's central park, once a quiet, ordinary space lined with picnic benches and a single rusted swing, something new had taken root, quietly but permanently. The town council, moved by the events that had unfolded only weeks before, had approved a small memorial installation tucked beside the footpath near the old oak tree. It wasn't grand, Maple Hollow didn't believe in loud gestures, but it was meaningful. At the heart of the display stood a glass case. Inside it, a slightly scuffed pink backpack rested atop a velvet cloth. Its zipper was still bent slightly, and one of the side pockets bore a faint smear of old, dried earth. It had once carried terror, secrecy, and hope. Now, it carried memory. Below the case was a bronze plaque. The engraving read, "When a child dares to trust, miracles begin." No names were included. But those who knew, knew. On the morning of the unveiling, Ellie wore a hand-knit sweater 2 sizes too big, sleeves bunched at the wrists. Her hair was neatly braided by Sarah, who stood beside her with a calm strength that had replaced the tremble she once carried in her limbs. Sarah now walked with a gentle grace, head held higher than before. Her cheeks had more color, her eyes more clarity. She had started taking part in counseling sessions at the shelter and recently volunteered to assist at the clinic. The nurse in her, the healer, was returning. Beside them, Henry stood in his usual flannel and wool coat. His grizzled beard had been trimmed for the occasion, though his posture remained stoic. In one hand, he held Ranger's leash. The German shepherd sat alert, ears perked, wearing the collar Ellie had gifted him days before. A few familiar faces gathered for the dedication. Kate, ever watchful and grounded, handed out cups of warm apple cider to attendees. Mayor Owens, a round, cheerful woman with kind eyes and an oversized brooch shaped like a cardinal, gave a brief speech. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke of bravery, community, and the importance of listening to small voices. Then came the moment Ellie had prepared for in secret. She stepped forward and handed Henry a rolled-up sheet of thick sketch paper. "Can we put it up next to the plaque?" she asked softly. Henry unrolled it carefully. It was a drawing, done in marker and crayon. In the center, Ranger stood proudly, his tail mid-wag. On one side of him was Ellie, smiling up with eyes full of light. On the other side was Sarah, her arm protectively around her daughter. Behind them, in the background, stood a tall figure with kind eyes, a small smile, and a flat cap, Henry. Above them, in the bright yellow sky, were the words, "He stayed. So I stayed too." Kate knelt beside Ellie, eyes glistening. "That's beautiful," she said. "Let's make sure it never fades." They framed the drawing in a wooden case, sealing it behind protective glass next to the plaque. Later, as the small crowd began to disperse, Henry felt a tap on his shoulder. A tall man in uniform handed him a sealed envelope. The man introduced himself as Lieutenant Carver from the State Police's Public Honors Division. "You've been avoiding us," Carver said with a half-smile. "But this one you can't duck." Inside the envelope was a certificate bordered in blue and gold. It read, "In recognition of exceptional civilian bravery, awarded to Henry Foster and Ranger, for the rescue of endangered citizens and assistance in solving a cold case." Attached was a letter from the state commissioner himself, thanking Henry for quiet heroism that lit a way when others chose blindness. Henry grunted, a bit flustered, and scratched behind Ranger's ears. "Guess we did all right, huh?" Kate sidled up beside them. You did more than all right. You reminded this town what it means to show up. That evening, the sky over Maple Hollow burned with the colors of fire and honey. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Henry, Sarah, Ellie, Kate, and Ranger walked home together along the trail. The same one where it had all begun. Sarah paused near the old clearing and looked back. I used to think no one would ever believe me, she said softly. You didn't need everyone, Henry replied. You just needed one. Ellie tugged at his hand, then reached down and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck. No, she said. We needed him. The dog's tail thumped once against the dirt, steady and certain. They walked on, the last light trailing behind them like a promise whispered into dusk. Not all miracles come with trumpets from the sky. Sometimes, they come in the form of a frightened child with trembling hands, a mother locked away in silence, and a dog who simply refused to give up. In their darkest hour, they were not alone, because someone cared enough to listen. And in that quiet act of love, God moved. Maybe today, you're walking your own lonely trail. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to notice, to reach back, to believe you. This story is a reminder, even when the world turns its back, God does not. He works through the brave, the broken, and yes, even through a dog named Ranger. If this story stirred something in your heart, share it with someone who needs light. Leave a comment below, just one word, Amen, if you believe that faith, love, and courage can still change lives. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories that heal, and may God bless every soul who's watching. You are not forgotten.